The late afternoon sun turned the dust at Dagger Point's auction corral into swirling gold. The air carried the sharp smell of manure sweat and desperation. In the center of the pen, a white mare lay crumpled in the dirt, her coat matted with filth, every rib visible beneath her skin. Her breathing was so shallow, the flies circling her ears made more sound than the rise and fall of her chest. One foreleg was tucked beneath her at an unnatural angle. Her eyes, once perhaps bright, were dull as river stones, glazed with a film that spoke of either illness or something worse. She did not move when men shouted at her, did not flinch when boots kicked dirt in her direction. She simply lay there, waiting for death. Lot 17. Crooked Miles announced from his platform, his voice carrying the practiced boom of a man who had sold lies as easily as livestock for 20 years. He was thick-bodied with a face like weathered leather, small dark eyes that calculated profit in every glance. He wore a vest stained with tobacco juice and a hat with a rattlesnake band. Miles yanked hard on the lead rope attached to the mare's halter, jerking her head up with such force that her neck twisted painfully. A low moan escaped her nostrils, a sound so pitiful that even some of the hardened ranchers shifted uncomfortably. But the mare did not rise. Her head dropped back down, hitting the dirt with a soft thud. Laughter rippled through the crowd of ranchers and cowhands clustered along the rails. "That nag ain't worth the bullet to put her down," a man called out. Miles grinned, showing brown-stained teeth. "Starting bid $5. She's got some life left in her bones. Good breeding stock if you feed her up or butcher her for dog meat if that suits your fancy." No hands rose. The mare's breathing grew even more labored, and the flies settled on her ears and eyes without her bothering to twitch them away. Then a figure stepped through the gap in the rails and into the pen, his movement so quiet that several men did not notice until he was halfway to the mare. The laughter died like a candle flame, snuffed between wet fingers. Anape moved with the quiet certainty of a man who knew when to be seen and when to vanish. He was 35 tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back with a strip of leather. His face was marked by sun wind and experiences that had carved lines around his eyes and mouth. He wore a plain cotton shirt, buckskin leggings decorated with geometric patterns, and moccasins that made no sound on the hard-packed earth. On his left shoulder, barely visible through the fabric, was the puckered scar of an old bullet wound from the Powder River fights. He approached the mare slowly, palm open, fingers relaxed. He spoke in Lakota words soft as breath, carrying the rhythm of wind through grass. He knelt beside her, his knees sinking into the warm dirt, and placed one hand on her neck, feeling for the pulse beneath the matted coat. He ran his hand down her tucked leg, checking for breaks, then leaned close to her nostrils and breathed softly, letting her catch his scent. The mare's eye, the one not pressed into the dirt, rolled toward him with effort. For just a moment, something flickered there, recognition perhaps, or the faintest ember of hope. At the rail, a boy pressed his face between the weathered planks, his small hands gripping the wood until his knuckles went white. Lucas Reed was 11 years old, small for his age, but wiry and tough. He had a mop of sandy hair and freckles across his nose. His clothes were patched but clean, his mother made sure of that. Beside him stood his mother, Matilda Reed, a woman of 32 with a face that might have been beautiful if grief and exhaustion had not carved lines around her mouth and eyes. Her calico dress was faded but clean, and her hands were rough from work, from chalk dust and firewood from washing clothes and kneading dough. She taught school on Prairie Dawn Road, educating the children of miners and cowhands. Her husband Samuel had died 2 years ago when his horse team panicked on the switchback road from Cheyenne and crashed into a ravine. "Mama, look," Lucas whispered. "He's checking her like she's hurt, not lazy, like a real doctor would." Matilda said nothing, but her gaze followed Anape's hands as they moved over the mare's body with a gentleness that seemed out of place in this hard land. There was something in the way he touched the animal, not with pity, but with respect. Miles's grin faded. He cracked a long bullwhip against the side of the pen, and the sharp report made several men flinch. "Get on out of there, Scout. This is a legal auction, not a charity for every sad-eyed Indian who wanders in." Enepe straightened slowly and turned to face Miles. The two men locked eyes across the dusty pen, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken history. Enepe raised one finger, a single deliberate gesture, and held it there. "Enough." Miles's jaw tightened. "Fine. You want her bid then?" Enepe reached into a pouch at his belt and drew out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He opened it to reveal a dozen traders' scrip strips of tanned hide marked with the trader stamp from Fort Laramie. In the West, where coin was scarce, traders' scrip were as good as silver. 10 tags. Enepe said, his voice clear and steady. Market value $40. A murmur ran through the crowd. It was more than the mare was worth, far more than she should have been worth in her current condition. Miles's eyes narrowed. He saw the trap immediately. If he accepted, he would look like a fool for starting low. If he refused, he would look like a cheat. So he pushed back. $50. In coin or trade equivalent. Final offer. Enepe did not hesitate. He added 2 more tags and a small rolled deerskin. He placed them on the platform rail with a soft sound that was nonetheless final. Done. Miles snatched them up, counting quickly, then waved his hand in dismissal. Sold. Take your broken-down nag and get out of my corral. Enepe stepped back to the mare and spoke softly, his hand once again on her neck. He did not pull the rope or force her to rise. He simply waited. After a long moment, the mare shifted. Her ears swiveled forward just slightly. She gathered her legs beneath her, an effort that seemed to cost her every ounce of strength. Her muscles trembled like branches in high wind, but she managed to lift her head a few inches off the ground. It was not much, but it was something. Then from the alley behind the livery stable came the sharp crack of gunfire. The sound seemed to freeze time for a heartbeat before chaos erupted. Men shouted and cursed, scrambling back from the rails. 2 figures, cowhands in threadbare coats, burst from between the buildings, running hard with terror written across their faces. Behind them, 3 of Miles's hired guns fired pistols into the air. "Stop those thieves!" one of the gunmen yelled. "They stole hay from the boss's barn." The crowd scattered. Horses in the nearby corrals reared and screamed. Lucas pressed hard against the rail, his eyes wide, and Matilda grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back, but there was nowhere to go. The mare heard the shots. Some instinct buried beneath the drugs, and exhaustion suddenly flared to life. Her head snapped up with shocking speed, her eyes suddenly clear, and she scrambled to her feet with a violence that startled even Enepe. Her legs shook like saplings in a gale, but she rose. For a single heartbeat, she stood tall, a ghost of the animal she had been. Then her strength gave out completely. She staggered forward 3 lurching steps, directly toward the rail where Lucas stood frozen and collapsed with a heavy thud. Her body hit the dirt at an angle positioned now between the boy and the alley where the bullets had flown. If another shot had come wild, the mare's bulk would have blocked it. Silence fell over the corral like a heavy blanket. "What in blazes?" Miles muttered, staring at the fallen mare. Enepe stood over the mare, his hand once again on her neck, feeling the faint flutter of her pulse. She was still alive, but barely. But what she had done, rising at the sound of gunfire, staggering forward, and falling in just that place between the boy and danger, seemed impossible to explain by chance alone. Lucas's breath came fast and shallow. She got in front of me," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "Did you see that, Mama? She got in front of me when the guns went off." Matilda knelt beside her son, her hands trembling as she checked him for injuries. She looked at Enepe across the dusty pen, and their eyes met a connection formed in that instant recognition of something neither could yet name, but both felt in their bones. Enepe lifted the mare's tangled mane in his hand and began to lead her step by careful step out of the pen. The mare struggled to rise again, her legs shaking, but with Enepe's shoulder supporting her weight, she stood. She swayed like a tree in high wind, but she took one step then another, following him through the gate and into the street beyond. The crowd watched in silence, and in that silence something shifted, a seed of respect perhaps, or simply the recognition that they had witnessed something strange and unexplainable. The Lakota camp near Dragonfly Creek was a place of movement and memory. 7 lodges stood in a loose circle among the cottonwoods, their hide covers painted with symbols of family and history. The camp moved every few weeks, following water and game, staying ahead of the white settlers who pushed ever westward. Enepe's lodge was smaller than most, set slightly apart near the creek bank. He lived alone, a choice that some in the camp understood and others questioned. There had been a wife once years ago before the soldiers came to Powder River. Her name had been Winona, and she had died in the winter that followed the battles when food was scarce and sickness took the weak. Enepe did not speak of her to anyone. That grief was a scar deeper than the bullet wound on his shoulder. He had become a scout and interpreter because survival demanded it. The old ways were dying as surely as winter killed flowers. In their place came treaties written in English surveyors with their chains and stakes, and men like Crooked Miles, who saw the Lakota as obstacles to profit. Enepe traded horses' meat and access to clean water with the townsfolk of Dagger Point, and in return he bought a fragile peace. The white mare, he called her Ghost, lay now in a patch of shade near his lodge. He had walked her slowly from the auction, stopping every few minutes to let her rest, speaking to her constantly in Lakota. By the time they reached the camp, the sun had dipped below the horizon. Dr. Edwin Harper arrived shortly after dusk, carrying his battered medical bag and wearing an expression of weary concern. He was a wiry man in his 50s, with spectacles held together by wire and a coat patched at the elbows. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the whiskey he drank to dull the memories of things he had seen during the war. He was one of the few white men in Dagger Point who did not treat Enepe like a curiosity or a threat. Edwin knelt beside Ghost, his hands moving over her ribs and legs with careful precision. He lifted her upper lip, checking her gums, then leaned close to her nostrils and sniffed deeply. His nose wrinkled. "Laudanum," he said quietly. Enepe frowned. "Opium. You are certain?" "As certain as I can be without laboratory equipment." Edwin ran his fingers along the mare's neck until he found what he was looking for. There, barely visible beneath the grime, were 2 small puncture marks. Someone injected her, made her drowsy, weak, unresponsive, easy to dismiss as worthless. Classic auction sabotage, though more systematic than I've seen before. Enepe's jaw tightened. Why would someone do this? Money, of course. Edwin sat back on his heels, wiping his hands on a rag. Buy a good horse cheap when she is drugged and appears worthless, wait for the opium to wear off, then resell her for full price. The profit margin can be substantial. And Miles. He shook his head. It is not the first time I have seen this pattern. Over the past year, I have examined 6 horses with similar symptoms, all purchased at Miles's auctions. A rustle in the brush made them both turn. A young man stepped into the clearing hands, raised his movements jerky with fear and exhaustion. He was pale thin as a rail fence, with a patchy beard and eyes that darted like a cornered animal. His clothes were worn and dirty, and he carried the smell of someone who had been sleeping rough. His accent when he spoke was thick with Eastern Europe. Please, I need help. I am sorry to intrude, but I have nowhere else to turn. Enepe rose slowly, his posture alert, but not threatening. Who are you? My name is Victor. Victor Petrovich. My brother Ivan and we came from near Kiev 3 years ago. We were told there was land here opportunity. But when we arrived, we had no money for homesteading. So we take jobs wherever we can find them. Miles, he promised us wages, regular work. But he pays in scrip only good at his company store and the prices. Victor's voice broke. The prices are so high that we owe more at the end of each month than we earned. We are trapped. Edwin leaned forward. You work for Miles? I did. We did. Until yesterday. Victor looked around nervously. Yesterday, Ivan and we see something in the livery. Behind the hay bales hidden beneath old tarps, crates. We open one. Inside are bottles, many bottles. Laudanum marked with the pharmacy stamp from Cheyenne. Maybe 40-50 bottles in that crate alone, and there are 3 crates. Enepe and Edwin exchanged a glance. And there is more. Victor continued his words, coming faster. A ledger, thick, bound in leather with a lock that someone had left open. We open it, and we see names, brands, prices, horse descriptions, dates of purchase and resale. Many of the brands I recognize from the auctions. And some of the buyer names, they appear multiple times, but I have never seen these people. I think they are false names, you understand, created to hide the trail of money. Edwin stood, his hands shaking. What you are describing is systematic fraud on a scale that could destroy dozens of families. If Miles is drugging horses to buy them cheap, then selling them through false companies when they recover, that is conspiracy, that is criminal enterprise. That could put him in prison for years. But if we tell the sheriff, Victor said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, Miles will say we lie. He will say we are immigrants with debts, criminals trying to deflect blame. Sheriff Tom owes Miles money, everyone knows this. Tom will not act against him. Enepe nodded slowly. Where is your brother now? Hiding, in the willows near the creek, maybe half a mile downstream. He bleeds from a wound in his leg. One of Miles's men shot at us when we ran. Not deep enough to kill, but enough to slow him down. Edwin picked up his bag. I need to see him immediately. If the wound is deep and infection sets in, he will lose the leg or worse. Enepe made a decision. Bring him here after full dark. We will hide him in my lodge, and we will talk about what to do with what you know. Victor hesitated, then bowed his head. Thank you. You understand what it means to be hunted, to be seen as less than human by those who have power. I understand, Enepe said quietly. Everyone here understands, whether they admit it or not. Matilda Reed walked the dusty path from the schoolhouse to her rented cabin as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. Lucas walked beside her, kicking stones, his mind clearly elsewhere. She knew without asking that he was thinking about the mare, about the way she had risen at the sound of gunfire and fallen in front of him. Boys that age needed heroes, and dagger point offered few who could bear close scrutiny. Enepe was different, quiet, competent, someone who acted rather than talked. Matilda understood the appeal, even as she worried about what it meant for her son to admire someone the town considered an outsider at best. The cabin was small, 2 rooms with a tin roof that rattled in the wind and leaked in 3 places when it rained hard. The furniture was sparse, a table built from scrap lumber, 2 chairs with uneven legs, a narrow bed where she and Lucas slept side by side for warmth in winter. A trunk held everything they owned. On the wall above the trunk hung a single photograph in a cracked frame. Samuel Reed stood beside a freight wagon, his face serious beneath a wide hat. He had been 34 when the image was taken just 2 months before he died. Samuel had been a freighter hauling goods between Cheyenne and the mining camps. It was dangerous work that paid well because of the risks. 2 years ago, on a narrow switchback above Copper Creek, his team had panicked. The wagon and horses and man had plummeted down the slope. Samuel's body had been found 3 days later at the bottom of the ravine, broken beyond recognition. The debts had come quickly after that. Samuel had borrowed to buy the team and wagon, and the bank wanted repayment. Matilda sold what she could, but it was not enough. The bank took the cabin they had been buying, leaving her with nothing but the right to rent a smaller place. That evening, she cooked a simple meal beans seasoned with salt pork cornbread and water from the well. They ate in silence, but Lucas finally spoke, his voice tentative. "Mama, do you think that mare knew that she was protecting me?" Matilda looked at her son, seeing the hope in his eyes and the need to believe the world held some small kindness. She wanted desperately to tell him yes, but she was a school teacher trained to value truth over comfort. "I think she was frightened," Matilda said gently. "And sometimes when creatures are frightened, they move in ways we do not expect. It may have been chance, Lucas, just coincidence that she fell where she did." "But it felt like more," Lucas insisted. "It did," she admitted. "And maybe that is enough. Maybe the meaning is not in what the mare intended, but in what we choose to do with the memory of that moment." The answer seemed to satisfy him. After they finished eating, Lucas went to bed, curling up beneath a quilt that had belonged to Matilda's grandmother. Later, after Lucas had fallen asleep, Matilda sat on the cabin's narrow porch and looked out at the dark prairies stretching endlessly. The stars were impossibly bright, a river of light flowing across the black dome of sky. She wrapped her shawl tighter and let her mind wander, thinking about the Lakota scout Enepe. There was something in the way he had moved, the way he had knelt beside the mare without concern for the dirt or the mockery of the other men, that spoke of a kind of knowing she could not name. It was not pity, which always carried a sense of looking down, nor was it sentiment. It was recognition of suffering, perhaps, or of the way living things endured beyond what seemed possible. She thought about his hands on the mare's neck, careful and sure, and wondered what those hands had built, what they had destroyed, what scars they carried. She thought about the way his eyes had met hers across the dusty pen, after the mare fell, that moment of connection that had felt like something shifting beneath the surface of the world. Matilda shook her head, dismissing the thoughts as foolish. She had no time for such things, no room in her life for complications beyond survival. Keeping Lucas fed, keeping the school running, paying the rent. She could not afford to be distracted. She pulled her shawl tighter and went inside, closing the door against the night and all its unsettling possibilities. That night, in the deep darkness after moonset, 3 figures moved like ghosts through the shadows behind the livery stable. Enepe, Matilda, and Lucas crept through the dust, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Matilda had come to Enepe's camp earlier that evening with a question burning in her mind. Could he help her understand what Victor had seen? The immigrant's story had reached her through the network of gossip that connected everyone in Dagger Point. She did not fully trust the story, but she trusted her instincts. And those instincts said that Miles was more dangerous than most people realized. Enepe had listened to her explain what she knew and what she suspected. He had considered her words in silence, and then he had agreed to help, but only if she understood the risk. If Miles catches us inside his property, he will not ask questions gently, Enepe had said. He will call it theft, trespassing, whatever legal cover he needs. His men will act first and justify later. And the sheriff will not protect you, even if you are white and a school teacher and a widow with a child. I know, Matilda had said, and the steadiness of her voice had surprised even her. But I need to understand what happened to my husband. The accident never made sense. Samuel was too careful to make the kind of mistakes that would cause a panic. And if Victor is right, if Miles drugs horses, then maybe... She had trailed off, unable to finish the thought, but Enepe had understood. Then we go tonight, before Miles realizes what Victor saw and moves the evidence. We find the ledger, we see what it contains, and then we decide what to do with that knowledge. I am coming with you, Matilda had insisted. You need someone who can read quickly, who knows what to look for in financial records. I taught bookkeeping before I came west. And besides, if we find something about Samuel's horses, I need to see it with my own eyes. Enepe had studied her, weighing her determination against the danger, and had finally nodded. All right, but Lucas stays here with the camp. That was when Lucas had stepped forward. No, I am not a child anymore. I can help. I can keep watch. Lucas, Matilda had begun. Mama, I can blow a whistle. I can hide. I can stay quiet and still. You cannot leave me behind. Not after what happened today. I need to be part of this. Matilda had looked at Enepe, pleading silently for him to refuse. But Enepe had only nodded. He comes. But he listens and he obeys without question. If I say run, he runs. If I say hide, he hides. If I say be silent, he does not make a sound. Agreed. Lucas had straightened. Agreed. So now they stood at the back door of the livery Lucas positioned near the corner, with his tin whistle ready. 1 blast if riders approached from the main street, 2 blasts if danger came from the alleys, 3 blasts if he had to run. Enepe tested the door with careful fingers. It was latched from the inside, but the wood was old and warped. He slid his knife into the gap and lifted gently. The bar rose with a soft scrape, and the door swung open on hinges that squeaked once before falling silent. Inside, the livery smelled of hay and leather, of horse sweat and manure. Moonlight slanted through gaps in the walls, casting pale stripes across the floor. Enepe entered first, moving with absolute silence. Matilda followed, her breath shallow, her heart hammering. They found the crates exactly where Victor had described them, stacked behind a row of oat sacks covered with old tarps. Enepe pried the lid off the first crate with his knife and lifted it aside. Inside, nestled in straw, were rows of small glass vials filled with dark liquid. The labels read, Laudanum medicinal use, only Cheyenne Pharmacy, not for resale. There were at least 40 vials in the first crate, and a quick check of the second revealed even more, along with a wooden case containing syringes and needles. Matilda's hands trembled as she set a vial down. This was not just fraud. This was a systematic operation, carefully planned and executed over months or years. Keep looking, Enepe whispered. The ledger Victor mentioned. That is what we need most. They searched carefully until Matilda found it, a thick book, bound in cracked leather, tucked beneath a saddle blanket on a shelf. The ledger was locked, but the lock was cheap and old, and Enepe's knife made quick work of it. Matilda opened the book carefully. The entries were meticulous. Dates ran down the left margin, followed by descriptions of horses' breed, color, approximate age, distinguishing marks. Then came brand information, purchase prices paid at auction, supposed buyer names, and resale prices. As she scanned the pages by moonlight, patterns emerged. Many of the horses had been purchased at auction for far below market value, with notes like poor condition, or temperament issues, or unresponsive. But the resale prices showed them sold for 2, 3, sometimes 5 times what Miles had paid. The buyer names appeared repeatedly: Johnson Trading Company, Western Livestock Consortium, Frontier Horse Exchange, all entities that sounded legitimate, but that Matilda recognized none of. They had to be false names, shell companies created to hide the fact that Miles was both seller and buyer. Then near the back of the ledger she saw it. An entry that made her breath catch. Brand S.R. Reed, 2 horses, bay geldings, matched team. Age 6 years. Purchase date April 3rd, 1873. Price $24 total. Notes: resale pending temperament issues resolved with treatment. Expected profit $80 or $100. April 3rd, 1873. 1 week before Samuel died. Matilda stared at the entry, reading it again and again. Samuel had never mentioned selling them. He would not have sold them. They were essential to his freighting business. Unless he had not sold them. Unless Miles had another plan, another method of acquiring valuable property. Her mind raced, connecting pieces she did not want to fit together. If Miles drugged horses to make them appear worthless at auction, could he also drug them to make them dangerous? To make them panic and bolt at a critical moment? To cause an accident that would kill their owner, Matilda? Ennepe's voice was urgent. We need to take the ledger and go. Now. She nodded mutely, closing the book and clutching it to her chest, pressing it against her ribs where it would be hidden beneath her shawl. But before they could move toward the door, a light flared at the front of the livery, the harsh yellow glow of a lantern being turned up high. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moved toward them. A man's voice called out, "Thought I heard something back here. Come on out or I start shooting into the shadows." Scarface Sam, Miles's foreman, a brute of a man with a knife scar running from his left eye to his jaw. He was Miles's enforcer, the man who collected debts and delivered threats, and he carried a pistol on each hip. Ennepe grabbed Matilda's wrist and pulled her behind the oat sacks, pressing close to keep both of them out of the lantern's light. The space was narrow, forcing them together. She could feel the heat of his body against her back, his chest rising and falling in controlled breaths. His lips were close to her ear when he whispered, "Breathe quiet. Do not move. Do not even blink." Sam's boots scraped across the floor as he moved closer, the lantern casting wild shadows. He paused near the crates and kicked one of the tarps aside, checking the contents. "Better not be rats getting into the boss's supplies," he muttered. The lantern swung closer. For a terrible moment, Matilda was certain they would be discovered. The light painted the edges of the oat sacks, creeping toward their hiding place. She felt Ennepe's hand tighten on her arm, stay absolutely still. Then Sam grunted, apparently satisfied. He turned back toward the front of the livery. Probably just the wind. Place is falling apart anyway. The door creaked as he left, and the light faded. They stayed frozen for a long minute, until they were absolutely certain he was gone. "We go?" Ennepe whispered. "Now." Matilda nodded, tucking the ledger more securely inside her shawl. They moved toward the back door and slipped outside into the darkness. Lucas appeared from the shadows. "I did not need to whistle," he whispered proudly. "I stayed quiet the whole time." "You did well," Ennepe said, placing a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "Very well. Now we run." They ran through the alleys of Dagger Point, keeping to the shadows. They had nearly reached the edge of town when a shot rang out, not close, but not distant either. The bullet did not come near them, but it was followed by shouting in Russian-accented English, and then another shot. Victor and Ivan were in trouble. They rounded a corner and saw 2 figures struggling near the creek bank, Victor trying to support his brother Ivan, who was clutching his thigh, blood seeping between his fingers. Behind them, Scarface Sam and 2 other men were advancing, their pistols drawn. Ennepe did not hesitate. He sprinted back toward the creek. Matilda screamed his name without meaning to, but he did not stop. He reached Ivan just as Sam raised his pistol for another shot, grabbed the wounded man by the collar, and half-dragged, half-carried him toward a small stand of willows. Matilda found herself moving without conscious thought, pushing Lucas toward a gap in a broken fence, then turning back to help Victor. Another shot rang out, and Matilda felt the air pressure change near her ear, a bullet passing close enough to hear. Into the willows, Enepai shouted. Stay low and follow the creek bed downstream. They crashed into the willows, and Enepai threw Ivan down into the dry creek bed. Matilda and Lucas tumbled after him, landing hard on rocks and sand. Victor collapsed beside them. More shots came, but the willows broke up the shooter's line of sight. Bullets thudded into tree trunks and kicked up dirt. Enepai returned fire with his rifle, 3 measured shots that forced the pursuers to take cover. They will circle around. Enepai said, his voice calm. We have maybe 2 minutes. We need shelter walls somewhere we can defend. The church! Matilda gasped. 2 blocks north, stone walls, heavy doors. Father Matthews is in Cheyenne. It will be empty. Can we reach it without being seen? If we stay in the creek bed until we hit Ash Street, then run across open ground. 30 seconds of exposure. Enepai looked at Ivan, at the blood still seeping from his leg. Moving him would be agony, but staying here meant death. We go? Enepai decided. Victor, you take your brother's left side. I take his right. Matilda, you and Lucas run ahead and get those church doors open. They moved, scrambling along the creek bed with Ivan between Victor and Enepai. Matilda and Lucas climbed out at Ash Street and ran across the open space, expecting bullets at any moment. But they reached the church, a small stone building with a square tower, and Matilda threw herself against the heavy wooden door, praying it was unlocked. The door opened. Thank whatever gods watched over desperate people, Father Matthews never locked it. They tumbled inside, and moments later, Enepai and Victor came through carrying Ivan. Enepai slammed the door shut and dropped the heavy bar into its brackets, a thick beam of oak that would not stop a determined assault, but would buy them time. The church was dark, except for moonlight filtering through the narrow windows. How long before Miles brings everyone? Victor asked. Minutes, Enepai said grimly. He knows we have the ledger. He will come with everyone he can gather. Matilda looked around the church. The building was small, maybe 30 feet square, with a small altar at one end and rough benches for seating. The walls were stone 2 feet thick, built by German settlers 20 years ago. The windows were narrow slits designed more for ventilation than light. There was one door at the front where they had entered, and a smaller door at the back that led to a tiny sacristy. We can defend this, Enepai said. The walls are good, the doors are solid. If we ration our ammunition and shoot carefully, we can hold them off for a while. How long is a while? Lucas asked, his voice small but steady. Long enough for someone to get help, perhaps. Long enough for Miles to make a mistake. Enepai checked his rifle, 15 rounds remaining, plus the knife at his belt. Does anyone else have weapons? Matilda shook her head. Victor had nothing. Ivan had a small pistol in his belt, but he was too weak from blood loss to use it. Then we make do with what we have, Enepai said. Matilda, take Lucas to the back room and barricade yourselves in. If they break through, you run out the back door and do not stop. No, Matilda said flatly. We stay together. If we are going to die, we die together. Before Enepai could argue, the sound of horses and voices filled the street outside. Many horses, many voices. Through the narrow windows, she could see torches being lit, could see shadows moving as men surrounded the church on all sides. Then Miles's voice rang out. You in the church, this is your last chance. Send out that ledger and the scout, and I will let the woman and boy go free. You have my word. Your word is worth less than the dirt we stand on. Matilda shouted back, rage overcoming caution. You killed my husband. You drugged his horses and caused that crash. The ledger proves it. A moment of silence. Then Miles's voice came again, colder now. Then you have chosen death. We will burn you out, and when you run from the flames, my men will shoot you down. Your choice. Enepe moved to the window and looked out, counting. He could see at least 20 men, maybe more, all armed. The odds were impossible. Even if he were the warrior his grandfather had been, he could not defeat 20 armed men with 15 bullets and a knife. But he could make them pay for every inch. He turned to Matilda and saw in her face the same determination, the same refusal to surrender that he felt in his own chest. Lucas was frightened, but not panicking, and Enepe felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "We hold," Enepe said. "As long as we can, we hold, and we trust that sometimes the right people win." Outside, men began piling brush and wood against the church door, preparing to set it ablaze. Inside, 5 people waited in the darkness and held on to hope that was fragile as glass, but all they had. Then from the back of the church came a voice that froze everyone in place. "That is enough, Miles. Call off your men." Sheriff Tame Tom stepped out of the sacristy, where he had apparently been hiding his pistol drawn, but pointed at the floor. He looked like a man who had finally been pushed past the point where cowardice was possible. "Tom." Miles's voice came from outside, confused and wary. "What in blazes are you doing in there?" "Stopping you from making this worse than it already is," Tom said, moving to the door, but not opening it. "I have been a coward and a fool, Miles. I have let you run this town because I owed you money and was afraid. But I am done. You have gone too far, threatening a child, trying to burn down a church. I sent a telegram to the federal marshal in Cheyenne 3 weeks ago, Miles. I told him everything I knew about your operation. I have been waiting for him to arrive, playing along with you, because I needed evidence. But now you have trapped yourself. You have 20 witnesses standing outside a church you are trying to burn, and that is enough to hang you 3 times over." "You are bluffing," Miles snarled, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Am I?" Tom moved to the window. "If I am bluffing, why is Marshal Hendricks riding into town right now with 6 federal deputies? Look south toward the depot. You can see their torches." Enepe moved to the window and looked. At first he saw nothing, but then he saw them lights moving up the main street, torches held high, and beneath them the glint of federal badges catching firelight. 7 riders coming fast. Miles saw them too. Through the window, Matilda could see his face in the torchlight, could see the calculation flickering across his features as he weighed options and found them all bad. "This is not over," Miles said, his voice carrying venom. "You hear me, Scout? This is not over." "Yes, it is," Tom said quietly. "It is finally over." Marshal Hendricks arrived at full gallop, his horse scattering the crowd of Miles's men. He was in his 40s, stocky and solid, with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen every variation of human wickedness. He carried the federal star pinned to his vest and the authority of the United States government. "Crooked Miles," Hendricks said, his voice carrying, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, unlawful trade in opiate preparations, conspiracy to commit murder, and about 15 other offenses. You will drop your weapon and surrender yourself into custody, or my deputies will shoot you where you stand. Your choice." Miles looked around at his men, perhaps hoping for loyalty. But one by one they backed away, dropping weapons, raising hands. Even Scarface Sam saw the writing on this wall and let his pistol fall to the dirt. Miles stood alone in the torchlight, diminished and defeated. Finally, slowly, reluctantly, he raised his hands in surrender. Inside the church, Matilda felt her knees give way, and she sat down hard on a bench, the adrenaline draining out of her body. Lucas collapsed against her, and she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight, while he cried silently into her shoulder. Enepe lowered his rifle and turned to Tom. "You really sent that telegram 3 weeks ago." Tom nodded, his face haggard but relieved. When I heard about Samuel Reed's accident, something did not sit right. Samuel was too good a teamster to panic his horses without cause. And I remembered seeing Miles talking to Samuel the week before, remembered seeing money change hands. I started watching, started listening, and I heard enough to know that Miles was into something bad. So I sent the telegram, told Hendricks everything, and asked him to come, but to take his time to let me gather evidence. He looked at Matilda, his eyes full of shame and regret. I am sorry I could not save your husband, Mrs. Reed. But I could at least make sure Miles paid for it. You saved us tonight. Matilda said, her voice thick with emotion. That is enough. Outside, Hendricks and his deputies were rounding up Miles's men. The marshal entered the church and looked around at the 5 people who had held out against impossible odds. Something like respect flickered across his weathered face. You people are either the bravest or the most foolish I have seen in 20 years of federal law, he said. Maybe both. Sheriff Tom tells me you have evidence. Matilda pulled the ledger from inside her shawl and handed it to him. Everything you need is in there. Names, dates, prices, all of it. And there are crates of laudanum in the livery that prove the unlawful trade in opiate preparations. Hendricks took the ledger and flipped through it, his eyebrows rising. This is damning. With this and Tom's testimony and the physical evidence, we can put Miles away for 20 years, maybe more. He looked at Enepe. The judge will want your testimony too about the mare you bought and what the doctor found. I will testify, Enepe said. Whatever is needed. Hendricks nodded and turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. We found something when we searched Miles's office. A bill of sale partially burned. It lists 6 horses, Samuel Reed's full team, plus 1 white mare, age 8, temperament gentle. It is dated a week before Reed died. The mare's description matches the one you bought at Auction Scout. She was part of Reed's team originally. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ghost, the mare who had risen and fallen to block bullets, who had been the thread that unraveled Miles's entire operation, had belonged to Samuel. She had been there when he died, had probably survived. The crash had been taken by Miles and then drugged to hide her origin. Matilda felt tears stream down her face. She was his horse. She was with him when he died. Yes, Hendricks said gently. And because of her, because you bought her and discovered what had been done to her, Miles's entire operation came apart. Sometimes justice works in strange ways. After he left, they sat in the church in silence, exhausted beyond words. Victor tended to his brother. Tom sat on a bench with his head in his hands. And Enepe stood at the window, watching the prisoners being loaded into wagons for transport. Matilda came to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they stood there in the darkness, neither speaking, both understanding that they had survived something that would connect them forever. What happens now? She asked finally. Now Miles goes to prison. Now the territory knows what he did. Now your husband's name is cleared. Enepe turned to look at her, and in the dim light, his eyes were clear. And now you and Lucas are safe. The debts Miles held are void contracts obtained through fraud. You can keep your cabin, keep the school, build the life Samuel wanted for you. And you? The question hung between them. What will you do? Enepe was quiet for a long moment. The camp will move north with the seasons, as it always does. My people need me. But, he paused, but I find I have reasons to return to Dagger Point to not be always moving. Lucas could learn skills that will serve him. And you? He trailed off, not finishing the thought, but his hand found hers in the darkness, and their fingers intertwined. Stay, Matilda said simply. Not forever, not in a way that cuts you off from your people. But stay enough to teach Lucas. Stay enough to build something that might, if we tend it carefully, grow into something more. I will stay, Enepe agreed, as long as I am welcome. You will always be welcome. They stood together as dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And through the narrow windows, they could see Dagger Point waking to a new day that would be different from all the days before it. The trial was held 6 weeks later in Cheyenne, in a proper courthouse with a full jury and a judge who took his duties seriously. Miles and Scarface. Sam sat at the defendant's table flanked by lawyers, hired with the last of Miles's rapidly evaporating resources. The prosecution presented its case, methodically building layer upon layer of evidence. The ledger was entered as Exhibit 1. The crates of laudanum were wheeled into the courtroom, 40 bottles that represented enough opiate to drug 100 horses over a year. Edwin Harper testified about the horses he had examined, about the needle marks and symptoms consistent with deliberate opiate administration. Viktor Petrovich testified about what he had seen in the livery, his voice steady despite his fear. Ranch hands who had worked for Miles testified about orders they had received, about conversations where Miles had openly discussed manipulating auction prices. Sheriff Tom testified about the debts Miles had held over him, about the pressure to ignore complaints, about his growing suspicions that had led him to contact federal authorities. His badge was gone and he faced his own lesser charges, but his cooperation had earned him a measure of redemption. Matilda testified about finding the ledger, about the entry concerning Samuel's horses, about the bill of sale that showed premeditated murder disguised as business. Her voice was steady throughout. Though Enepe, sitting in the gallery, could see the emotion she held barely in check. Enepe testified last, among the main witnesses, describing the auction ghost's condition. The systematic pattern of fraud he had observed over years of trading in Dagger Point. The defense argued that it was circumstantial, that no one had proven Miles personally administered drugs or explicitly ordered murder. But the jury saw through these arguments. They had heard too much, seen too much evidence. After 4 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict guilty on all counts. Judge Boone delivered the sentence with a granite expression. Crooked Miles, you have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, systematic fraud, unlawful trade in opiate preparations, obstruction of justice, arson, and multiple counts of assault. The evidence shows a pattern of criminal behavior spanning years characterized by complete disregard for law and human dignity. I hereby sentence you to 25 years hard labor in the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie, with no possibility of parole. All property and assets will be seized and distributed as restitution to your victims. He turned to Scarface Sam. You have been found guilty of attempted murder, assault, arson, and obstruction of justice. I sentence you to 15 years hard labor. The courtroom erupted in applause. Miles's face went red with impotent rage, and he lunged from his chair shouting curses, but the bailiffs restrained him and dragged him toward the door that led to the cells below. As he passed Matilda and Enepe, Miles spat toward them, his final gesture of contempt, but they did not react. They simply watched as the man who had caused so much suffering was led away, diminished and defeated. Outside the courthouse, Matilda found Enepe and Lucas waiting on the steps. Victor and Ivan were there too, along with Edwin and Tom, and dozens of other people from Dagger Point who had come to see justice done. It is done, Matilda said, and the words felt both true and insufficient. Yes, Enepe agreed. It is done. Lucas tugged on Enepe's sleeve. Will you teach me to track like you promised? Enepe looked down at the boy and smiled. I will teach you many things. Tracking, reading weather, understanding horses, skills that will serve you in whatever life you choose to build. And you will stay in Dagger Point for as long as I am needed and welcome. Ennepe's eyes met Matilda's over the boy's head, and something passed between them. Recognition, respect, partnership. And beneath it all, the first tender shoots of something deeper that might, with time and care, grow into love. 3 months later, spring arrived on Prairie Dawn in a riot of green and gold. The grass grew tall and lush, and wildflowers painted the prairie in impossible colors: purple larkspur, yellow arrowleaf, red Indian paintbrush. The schoolhouse had been repaired and expanded, the roof properly patched, and a small addition built onto the back. A corral stood behind it, freshly built with sturdy rails, and in that corral stood 2 young horses, orphaned colts, from Miles's confiscated herd, awarded to Matilda as part of the restitution settlement that had also cleared all debts and secured permanent ownership of the cabin and pasture. Lucas worked with the colts every day after school, teaching them to accept a halter to stand for grooming, to trust human hands. Ennepe helped him, showing the boy how to read a horse's body language, the position of ears that signaled mood, the tension in muscles that indicated fear or relaxation. He taught Lucas to move with confidence, but without aggression, to earn trust rather than demand obedience. Matilda watched them from the schoolhouse doorway, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth as Lucas laughed at something Ennepe said. The sound of his happiness was so rare and precious that it made her chest ache with gratitude. The restitution from Miles's seized assets had been substantial enough to pay off all of Samuel's remaining debts, to purchase the cabin and pasture outright, to stock the school with new books and supplies. It was not wealth by any standard, but it was security, the first she had known since Samuel died. The Lakota camp had regrouped near Riven Oak, 30 miles north of Dagger Point. The people were resilient, had survived worse over the decades, and were already re-establishing patterns that had sustained them for generations. Ennepe visited them regularly, sometimes for days at a time, maintaining his connections and meeting his responsibilities. But he spent most of his time at the school teaching not just Lucas, but all the children about the land they lived on, how to read weather, how to find water, how to move quietly and observe without disturbing. It was an arrangement that suited both him and Matilda, close enough to build something together, but with enough space for him to maintain his independence and his ties to his people. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple, Matilda brought a quilt to the porch where Ennepe sat cleaning a wire cut on his palm from stringing new fence line. She sat beside him on the rough wooden bench that Lucas had built with Ennepe's guidance, and she cleaned the wound with whiskey, then wrapped it with strips of clean linen. "You do not have to stay," she said quietly. "If you want to go north with your people when they move for winter hunting, I would understand. You have obligations that existed long before you met us." "I know," Ennepe said, flexing his bandaged hand. He looked at her, and in the evening light, his face was softer than she had ever seen it. "But I want to stay. Not just for Lucas, though. Teaching him matters to me more than I expected. Not just because there is work here that needs doing, but because you and we have built something worth protecting. Something that started with necessity and danger, but has grown into something else, something I did not think I would find again after Winona died." Matilda's throat tightened at hearing him speak his late wife's name, at understanding that he was trusting her with his grief. "What have we built?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Partnership," Ennepe said carefully. "Trust that was earned through shared danger. Respect for each other's strength. And beneath all that, something deeper that is growing like plants from seeds we did not know we had planted. Not the passionate love that songs celebrate, that burns hot and fast and often consumes those who feel it, but something steadier, something that might last because it is rooted in reality rather than fantasy, in who we actually are rather than who we imagine ourselves to be." It was not a declaration of romantic love, not the kind of proposal that appeared in novels. But it was honest, rooted in truth, built on shared experience and mutual respect. And in many ways, that made it more valuable, more likely to endure the harsh realities of life in this territory. I want that too. Matilda said, her voice steady despite the emotion. I want to see what we are building continue to grow. I want Lucas to have a father figure who teaches him to be strong and competent and respectful. I want... She paused, gathering courage. I want to not be alone anymore. I want partnership. I want you. Enipe reached for her hand, and their fingers intertwined with natural ease. Then we build it together, day by day, season by season, for as long as it works and makes sense and brings us something better than we would have alone. They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged across the vast Wyoming sky, their bodies leaning toward each other with the instinct of people who had learned through danger that survival was easier shared. In the distance, coyotes sang their evening chorus, and from the corral came the soft sounds of horses settling for the night. Inside the cabin, Lucas slept deeply in the small room that was his alone, now his dreams untroubled. Under his bed, wrapped in oilcloth and stored in a wooden box Enipe had made, lay the ledger no longer needed for legal purposes, but kept as a record, as proof that sometimes the truth came to light and justice prevailed. 6 months after the trial, on a clear autumn morning when the air was sharp with coming winter, Matilda took Lucas to visit a small grave on a rise overlooking Dragonfly Creek. They had moved Ghost's remains from where she had died to this place closer to home, closer to where they could tend it and remember. The grave was marked with smooth stones from the creek bed and a wooden cross that Lucas had carved the name Ghost burned into the wood. They stood in silence for a while. Lucas placed a handful of wildflowers on the grave purple asters that still bloomed despite the cooling weather. "Do you think she understood?" Lucas asked. "Do you think she knew she was saving people?" Matilda considered the question carefully. "I think she was frightened and hurt and doing her best to survive in a world that had been cruel to her. I think her rising at the auction, her falling to shield you, all of those might have been instinct or accident, or simply the random movements of a panicked animal. But..." She paused. "But I also think that sometimes meaning is not in the intention, but in the result. Ghost's actions, whether planned or not, unraveled Miles's entire operation. Because of her, we discovered the truth. Because of her, your father's death was recognized as murder. Because of her, many families were saved from being cheated. That matters regardless of whether she understood what she was doing. So she was a hero even if she did not mean to be. Perhaps. Or perhaps she was just a horse who suffered and survived long enough to make a difference. Either way, we honor her by remembering, by making sure her story is told, by building something good from the tragedy that brought us all together." They walked back toward the cabin where Enipe was working in the corral with the young horses. He looked up as they approached and waved, and Lucas ran ahead to help. Matilda paused at the fence watching her son and the man who had become so important to both of them, and felt a sense of peace that had been absent for so long. It felt almost foreign. The world was still hard, still unforgiving, still full of dangers that would test them again. But for now, in this moment, they had safety and partnership and hope for a future that might be kinder than the past had been. The story told in Dagger Point and eventually across Wyoming territory became one of those legends that mixed fact and fiction until no one could quite separate them. People spoke of the dying mare who rose to block bullets of the Lakota scout, who uncovered a conspiracy through an act of compassion of the widow schoolteacher, who brought down a tyrant with nothing but courage and a stolen ledger. The details shifted with each telling, but the core remained true. A broken horse had been the thread that unraveled an entire criminal operation. Victor and Ivan prospered in their modest way, running an honest livery in Medicine Bow with Edwin Harper as their partner and friend. They never became wealthy, but they earned respect through hard work and fair dealing. Edwin continued his medical practice, serving the poor and the desperate, with steady competence, taking payment in barter when cash was unavailable. He drank less than he had before the demons that drove him to whiskey, quieted somewhat by the knowledge that his testimony had mattered. Sheriff Tom served 6 months in jail for corruption and was released on parole. A broken man who lived out his remaining years in quiet shame, but also with a measure of pride that in the end, when it truly mattered, he had found the courage to do the right thing. Crooked Miles died in Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie, 7 years into his sentence, killed in a fight with another inmate over something trivial. Few mourned him. Scarface Sam served his full sentence and emerged from prison, diminished, his face more scarred and his spirit broken, and he disappeared into the territories and was never heard from again. And Enepe stayed. Through seasons that turned from spring to summer to autumn to winter, and back again through years that marked Lucas's growth from boy to young man, through the slow transformation of Wyoming from frontier territory to something approaching civilization, he stayed. He walked between worlds as he had always done, maintaining ties to his Lakota people, while building a life in Dagger Point. He married Matilda in a quiet ceremony that honored both Christian and Lakota traditions, creating a partnership that scandalized some and inspired others, that demonstrated it was possible to bridge divides that most people thought were unbridgeable. They did not live without struggle. Prejudice was real, and persistent economic challenges were constant. But they built something that endured because it was rooted in reality rather than fantasy, and mutual respect rather than romantic delusion. In the understanding that love was not just feeling, but action, not just words, but daily choices to support and honor each other. Lucas grew into a man who spoke both English and Lakota, who understood both white and native perspectives, who could track game across bare rock and calculate compound interest. He became a voice for cooperation when others demanded separation, a bridge when others were building walls. On a spring morning, 20 years after the trial, Lucas stood at Ghost's grave with his own children, 2 daughters who had their grandmother's sharp eyes and their grandfather's quiet strength, and told them the story of the white mare who had changed everything. He told them about the auction where she had risen and fallen to shield him, about the drugs that had made her seem worthless, about the ledger that proved murder and fraud, about the desperate hours in the church, about the marshal arriving just in time, and Miles being dragged away in chains. He told them how Ghost had been his grandfather, Samuel's horse, part of the team that had been drugged and driven to panic to cause an accident that was actually murder. He told them how she had survived when Samuel had not, how she had been taken by Miles and hidden in plain sight through drugs and deception, how buying her had been the act of compassion that unraveled an entire criminal conspiracy. And he told them that sometimes the broken things of the world were the most important, that what appeared worthless could hold infinite value, that justice sometimes came through paths so strange and unexpected that they seemed like providence or fate. "Remember her?" he told his daughters as they placed flowers on the grave that was now weathered by 2 decades, but still tended, still honored. "Remember that one act of kindness, your great-grandfather buying a dying horse no one else wanted, changed everything. Remember that cruelty always plants seeds of its own destruction, that truth eventually emerges no matter how deeply it is buried, that courage can be found in the most unlikely people when circumstances demand it." From the house below, Matilda called them to dinner, her voice carried on the wind. She was in her 50s now, her hair gone gray, but her posture still straight, her mind still sharp. Enepe stood beside her on the porch, his hair also gray, his face more lined, but his eyes still bright with the intelligence and quiet strength that had first drawn her to him. They watched Lucas and the girls climb down from the rise, watched the next generation that carried forward the legacy of survival and partnership. and they felt the weight of years, but also the satisfaction of having built something that endured, something that would outlast them because they had planted it deep and tended it with care. The barbed wire at Blackthorn Creek had been removed years ago by town decree, the ford maintained now as public property accessible to all, regardless of race or status. The church still stood, its stone walls solid, and every year, on the anniversary of the siege, someone left flowers on the steps in memory of the night, when 5 people held out against impossible odds, and won because courage and truth proved at least that once to be stronger than money and violence. And on the rise overlooking Dragonfly Creek, marked by weathered stones, and a wooden cross slowly being reclaimed by the earth it stood in, lay the white mare who had been broken and discarded, but who had, through some combination of accident and fate and the simple, stubborn will to survive, become the key that unlocked justice for dozens of victims and changed the course of multiple lives. Ghost's story became a legend that mothers told their children, that travelers carried across the territory and beyond, that was repeated until it became myth. But beneath the myth lay truth, that kindness mattered, that cruelty carried consequences, that justice was possible, even in a world that often seemed designed to prevent it, that the weak and the broken could be instruments of change if someone cared enough to see their value, and that sometimes, in the vast and unforgiving landscape of Wyoming territory in the late 19th century, a dying white mare could save a boy from stray bullets, lead a scout to uncover murder, give a widow the evidence to destroy a tyrant, and in doing so prove that even in the hardest country and the darkest times, there was room for grace.